Skulls are without question one of my favorite things to draw or to paint. So this week I'm going to show you how I painted this study of a skull on canvas using a single color. But before we get into this painting tutorial, a common question that I see is why do so many people paint skulls? A simple answer to that question is honestly just because they look cool, but let's go a little bit deeper and take a quick look into some art history. The first reason, which is a common thread among all great artists throughout art history, is to study human anatomy. Here we have one of Leonardo's studies from the High Renaissance. These were dated from the late 1470s right up to his death around 1519. And there's just a ton of discovery and invention within this Codex Windsor manuscript. The detail in some of these drawings is just incredible. Toward the later years of his life, Leonardo performed multiple autopsies to study the human anatomy, and it's not just limited to the skull. He covered most of the human body through dissection because during this time period, it was a Renaissance humanism, and the sciences, or natural philosophy as it was called back then, and the arts, they were seen as one. And even though the study of anatomy isn't really seen as a priority these days among new artists, I promise you, I guarantee you that learning even the simpler stuff like the skeletal structures and the major muscle groups is only going to help you improve your art. Like anything important in life, it's a lot of work, it's intense, it's difficult. I studied this 2 years full-time to get my master's degree, but it's worth 100% of the effort that you put into it. You'll learn a ton and it's fun. It's very important information. And so that's the first reason. And the second has much more to do with aesthetics. The symbolism of a skull is a pretty obvious one. It's a reminder of our mortality, every single one of us. One of my favorite figure paintings, which is located at the Met here in New York, the Penitent Magdalene. This is a painting that haunted me since I was a kid. You can see in this work that very dramatic tenebrysm lighting, no doubt influenced by Caravaggio or the Caravagesque stylistic followers. That extremely high contrast adds to the drama and the sense of uneasiness to the painting, and it's also done in a limited palette. While she's looking away from us, you can see her hands are almost hesitantly in prayer, sitting on top of a skull. And while the candle, which is another obvious symbol, is burning very, very brightly and is reflected back to us by a mirror. To me personally, it's always been a painting about doubt and loneliness, along with the fear and despair that often tag along. You, of course, are free to interpret it any way you'd like. But that skull in her lap is just so important to the effect that this painting has always had on me. It's just an absolutely brilliant work of art, and I always have to spend some time with it every time that I'm at the Met. And so now before we get into this painting tutorial, I just want to talk about one more painting. If I had to vote for one skull painting that everyone should know of and see in person, it's this one. This is Skull of a Skeleton with Burning Cigarette by one of the greats of all time, Vincent van Gogh. Right off the bat, you're going to notice that signature brushwork with that thickly applied impasto oil paint. What I've always loved about this painting is not only that it's dark and distressing with that obvious memento mori trope, there's also a sense of humor in it, some satire with that lit cigarette. There's always this kind of playfulness and kind of a recalcitrance in a lot of Vincent's darkest works. He was in poor health and was studying anatomy at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, which is in Antwerp, in late 1885. Vincent's art career was actually very short. It was only 10 years, and this was at the halfway point, 5 years before his death. And he just wasn't happy there. He wasn't happy with his instructors and just decided to have a bit of fun with this one by adding that lit cigarette. There's a saying that I've always liked, that great art can comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Van Gogh was special. He saw the world a little bit differently than the rest of us, and he expressed it all right there on his canvases. If you're ever feeling a bit down or lonely, spend some time with some of Vincent van Gogh's works, because even in his saddest or darkest paintings, there's always a little bit of hope there. Vincent van Gogh's paintings do what all great art should do. It reminds us about what life is, rather than offering an escape from it. So with that little bit of art history, I hope you could see just some of the significance that the skull has. From here, let's move right along into this painting tutorial. Up on the screen now is a high-res photo of my completed painting. I will, of course, be including the grid and the reference photo that I used for this one up on the members page. For this painting, I'm working on a smooth canvas that I set up myself. That's my favorite surface to work on. The canvas size is 15 inches by 17 inches. I set up a 1x1 grid, and then I drew out all of my outlines and contours before starting this painting. The initial drawing was done with the 2H pencil, and for this entire painting, I'm using one color. The paint is Schmincke Aero Colors Black, and for this background right now, I'm spraying it directly out of the bottle, around 25-26 psi. The first thing that I'm doing here is spraying in the background along the left side of the painting. You can see that as I'm adding this paint, I'm adding it down slowly, just layer after layer until I get full coverage of a very dark black background. And just a reminder, it's important to wear a respirator when you're spraying paint. When I'm applying a background like this, spraying a fair amount of paint, there's going to be a lot of overspray in the air. I'm painting in an enclosed studio with great ventilation. I'm using a non-toxic water-based paint with distilled water as a reducer later on. And I'm wearing a respirator here because when you're spraying in a background like this, there's going to be a ton of overspray in the air. So it's very important to protect yourself. I used a freehand shield to map in that sharp line of the frontal bone against the black background. And what I'm doing here is coming in with that airbrush freehand and spraying in some black paint into the left orbit, which is that left eye socket. You can see that this part of the painting just fades into the background. So I'm just trying to get those softer outlines along the left side here where the frontal bone is going to start. I'll start adding some texture into this brow ridge on the frontal bone by erasing into that paint. Now I don't need to apply any extra paint here because the overspray from spraying in that black background got into this area. So I have plenty of paint there to erase into. The eraser that I'm using here is the Staedtler Mars Razor. It's an aggressive ink eraser, so it easily cuts into that paint on a smooth surface like this smooth canvas. And what this is doing is adding in some of the highlights for this texture. This is going to give off the illusion that some of these areas are slightly raised up toward the light source, catching the light. The light source is over to the right side, so that means each of these small corresponding shadows that I'm painting now are going to be to the left of the highlights. So as I continue along here, you'll see me using that eraser to pull out those brighter highlights and then going right back over to the airbrush and spraying in a shadow along to the left. I'm also using this eraser to erase into that black background to get the shape of the frontal bone here. I could extend it a little bit further out to the left. For any of the very bright highlights, I can use an electric eraser. That's going to pull out a lot of paint, so you got to be kind of careful with it. So for the majority of this, I will just be using a stick eraser. Once I get down some of that texture, I will glaze a thin amount of this black paint over the top just to knock down the values. As I'm doing this, I'm paying attention to my reference. That's going to be my guide, but of course, I'm not following it one-to-one. I'm not trying to get an exact copy of that photo reference. In some part of the painting, I'm going to exaggerate some things. In other parts, I'm going to subdue them. So as I build up this texture, you can see here that it's just a ton of layers over and over. Along to the right, I'm going to use a ripped piece of paper and spray in a few horizontal lines. Those are the shadows on this part of the texture, and then I'll use my eraser to pull out a few of the highlights just above them. And then a thin glaze over the top, that's going to knock down the contrast. As I start working my way down toward the nasal bone here, the edge is kind of softer, so I'm just painting it in freehand. I'll blend it out later with the eraser. That's going to be a reference point, and then right back over to the brow ridge using my electric eraser and that normal stick eraser, adding some more highlights into here. Because I have that grid set up on this painting, I'm essentially working square to square. I'll switch over to a ripped piece of paper to paint in this very sharp transition just to the right. Once that sharp edge along the bottom is painted in, I'll paint in the rest freehand just to get some softer blends there as we move up to the top of the frontal bone. This is going to be a reference point. You can see in my completed painting on the left side of the screen that this area that I'm circling, the left brow ridge, is in a kind of a bright highlight, just catching a bit of light, and then it fades off to the right into that really dark cast shadow by the brow ridge on the right side, just above the right orbit. So as I'm continually building up the layers here, I'm using a bit more pressure on my eraser in the brighter areas. That's going to pull out more paint. It's going to expose more of that gesso underneath, and it's just going to make it look like that area is brighter, catching some of that light. The top edge of this brow ridge is looking a little bit too soft right now, so I'll come in with a ripped piece of paper again, line it up along the edge just over a few parts, and spray some of that black paint into the background. I want to set in a brighter plane right along the center here, so in order to erase it out, I'm going to switch over to the electric eraser, and I'm just going to add a bunch of small dots and little squiggles with that eraser next to each other to pull out one really bright highlight right in the center here. The top part of the frontal bone has a smooth transition from the black background to the bone itself. So I use the airbrush freehand to spray along that transition point, and I'll continue with the airbrush freehand here just to spray in some of the texture that I'm seeing in the reference. A lot of these freehand dots are going to be very soft because that's what the airbrush naturally does, so if I want to sharpen a few up, I can use a texture template like I'm using here, just spray over the top of it. That's going to add some dots into this area and just help add some randomness to it, just kind of break up any of the natural pattern that you find yourself naturally adding into a painting. After a glaze of black paint is added over the top, I switch over to the eraser like I'm doing here, and I'm start adding in some of the highlights. I'm essentially just scuffing up the paint with that eraser, adding some random highlights within this area. And you'll notice that a lot of this right now is way too bright compared to the completed painting on the left side of the screen. These layers are going to kind of work like an underpainting. As I glaze more paint over the top later on, everything is going to get knocked back. But that initial texture is still going to stay there. So as I build up texture on top of it, it just adds more depth to it. It makes it look a lot more complicated than it actually is. As I move farther along to the right, I want to get another reference point in. So I'm switching over to a freehand shield. I'm lining it up along the edge of the frontal bone, just at that transition point where it starts switching over to the parietal bone, and then spraying some black paint into that background. For a few more of these textures on the frontal bone, I'll use a ripped piece of paper, spray in some lines, and then glaze a thin amount of this paint over the top. You can see that I accidentally sprayed some of those lines too dark. It's not a big deal using this technique because as I erase into this area, I could just push them all back. A few passes over the top will lighten everything up. Most of those mistakes will just disappear. As I continue along the frontal bone, the first thing I did here was glaze some paint over to the right side and then right back over to the eraser. I'll use the same technique over and over just to build up that texture, those micro details. And then one thing that I'm always doing is to step back from my painting and see both my painting and the reference at a distance. And while I'm doing that, I'm just comparing and contrasting those major values of light and dark. The major masses of value are the most important thing to set the planes and the illusion of the final painting. Textures and micro details are always second place to those major values of light and dark. And you can see at this point that I got most of that texture in on the frontal bone. This is going to be good enough for now. I'll stop right at that suture before the parietal bone comes in, and from here what I want to do is start adding in the orbit. Now there's a lot of ways to go about doing this, but the edges of the orbit need to be very sharp, so I'm using a freehand shield. You could of course use a stencil, a cutout, Frisket film, whatever you like, but I'm just going to use a freehand shield for now and work my way along the outer contours of this orbit. You can see that the shadow is really dark along the lower right side of this, so I started at the bottom where the maxilla and the right side where the zygomatic bones are. And when I use that freehand shield, I just sprayed some paint over to the left. You can see that I sprayed it very lightly right now. This is going to need to be very dark later on, pure black in some areas, but I'm keeping it light for now. This way I could adjust it if anything's a bit off. And again, that orbit, or the eye socket as it's often called, is going to be my reference point. So I know where this is going to be. I'll move right back up to the frontal bone and just continue along using the same techniques. I glaze some paint right above the orbit, and I'll just work into this area again with that eraser, scuffing it up, building up that texture. Now what I'm going to do is I'll use my airbrush freehand here, glaze a thin amount of paint over some of the darker parts of the frontal bone. This is just like what I talked about before. It knocks back all the contrast, and then I can come in with a softer eraser like what I'm doing here and just lighten up those highlighted areas a bit more. If I need to sharpen up some of the edges along the outside of the skull, I just go back to my freehand shield, line it up, spray some black paint into the background. When I'm painting, I always go back, revisit areas, rework them a little bit more. So I will come back to this later, but for now what I want to do is darken up some of the value within the orbit itself. Since I already have those sharper edges painted in, I'll just start filling this in freehand. If any of the overspray gets into the surrounding area, it's no big deal on this one because I'm erasing into the paint anyway. And I'm working very slowly here. I know that a lot of parts of the video are sped up to keep these short and concise, but I'm always taking my time, painting methodically, slowly working from one part to the next. Just above the orbit, there's a small shadow. I'll paint this in freehand, just kind of spraying in some dots here. And as I move along to the left, I want to paint this suture in just above the nasal bone. I'm using a ripped piece of paper, spraying some of the paint up. The value in some of these sutures, which is the cracks or the crevices between each one of the bone plates, is going to need to be pretty dark, so I sprayed a fair amount of paint in there. And then to add some more texture, I just used a template, sprayed some paint over in a few areas, added a few random dots. Now from here, you can see that this section is in a very bright highlight, so we need to start removing some of that paint to lighten this up. I'll start above the orbit on the frontal bone and start erasing out in some small circular motions. Now, because I'm working on a gessoed surface, I get a lot of control on how much paint I want to remove, and it's all dependent on the amount of pressure that I use on this eraser. I'm using another aggressive eraser here. This is a 7058 by Faber-Castell, and this Schmincke Aerocolor Black erases so beautifully on this surface. I just get a ton of control, no smearing, no smudging of that paint. The downside with this paint is it's expensive, unfortunately, especially here in the United States. Along the left side of the orbit, I'll add a softer line in freehand, and then as I move into the highlight here within the orbit, I'll start erasing it out, overlapping small circular motions. This way, I pull out a large mass of that highlight rather than a bunch of small textures. And now in these early stages, something that I always like to mention is you're going to go through an awkward phase of your painting. Especially if you're new or you're just starting out, you're going to look at this part of the painting, compare it to the original, what it's supposed to be, and just think it looks completely wrong. But it's important to remember that you're building up the foundation here, the first few steps to get to a final painting. That's why a grid could be so helpful, because it forces you to focus in on one small section of the painting rather than trying to take in the whole thing at once. If you try to paint the entire work in one shot, you're going to end up rushing. It's very, very important to slow down, take your time. And what I'm doing here is just essentially drawing, but instead of using pencil or charcoal, I'm using an airbrush and I'm using an eraser. I want to just paint in that transition between the frontal bone and the parietal bone. There's a suture in there, and these always look like cracks in the skull, but it's a fibrous band. It connects those two bones of the skull. And the way I'm going to paint this in is just using a ripped piece of paper. I'm going to follow my initial line drawing that I drew out using that grid. And you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just lining up that ripped piece of paper with my initial drawing and spraying a small amount of paint right over the top. This way that texture from the ripped piece of paper gets transferred right over to my canvas. Now, as I was doing this, I made a very common mistake. I accidentally sprayed too much paint. You can see these lines are very dark here compared to my completed painting on the left side of the screen. For the techniques that I'm using, that's not a big deal, because later on, I'll erase into this area, I'll remove a fair amount of that paint, and I'll knock down much of that value. So here's a quick example of that. You can see that as I'm adding some texture in here, I'm going over those sutures with the eraser, just lightening them up. If I remove too much paint, it's no big deal. I can always go right back to the airbrush with a ripped piece of paper, spray it back in. A few of the smaller ones I will paint in freehand, and then I'll adjust them later on with the eraser. And so as I move along to the right here, I will just add a little bit more paint into that background using my shield, just spraying some paint over to the right. And for the right side of the painting here with the temporal bone and the parietal just above it, this is going to be the last part. I'm going to get to this after I finish adding in everything else. So I'm just getting some of the texture in for now, but we'll come back to this later on in the painting. So from here, let's move into the center of the painting, right between the two eyes near the nasal bone. For a few of the darker lines or sutures, I will use that ripped piece of paper technique, and then for some of the thinner ones, I'll just paint them in freehand. And then over to the left where we have some texture, I'll spray in some soft dots freehand, glaze some paint over the top. That gives me something to work into. Then I could switch over to the eraser, just like before, start scuffing up the paint, adding in some of those highlights. I noticed that a few of the lines were a bit too dark, so one pass over with the eraser, you can see that those lines remain. I don't lose anything, they just get softer and lighter. Before I start painting in those really dark values within the nose, I'm going to take a ripped piece of paper here, line it up with that edge of the orbit and the maxilla bone, and spray some paint in. This way I just extend some of that shadow within the orbit moving up toward the nasal bone. And I'll continue with that ripped piece of paper along the maxilla bone, moving along to the zygomatic, spraying that paint up into the orbit. This way we get that very, very dark value in there. There's also some dark values over to the left, so I'm using a ripped piece of paper, spraying those in, and just trying to clean everything up with an eraser. For a few of these very thin highlights, I like to run my eraser through an electric pencil sharpener. That gives it a very thin, sharp point. It's not going to last that long. The tip will eventually break off when it's very sharp, but just for a short amount of time, you're going to have some ability to get in and just add some really thin highlights. A little bit of freehand detail in here is just going to help clean things up. Now what I want to do is use a ripped piece of paper, line it up with the left side of the maxilla, and I'm going to spray some paint right into the center here, get this value very, very dark. My apologies for blocking off some of this with my hand, but you can see what I'm doing here. I'm lining up the paper with the maxilla and the nasal bone, just spraying the paint over to the left and below it. The value in here is going to need to be pure black, just like the outside of the painting. I'll move along to the left side and I'll do the same thing, just working my way down. You'll notice that I'm trying to direct the paint right to left. This way the paint doesn't get underneath that shield. Over to the right, I'll just kind of tilt the shield up, form a dam with it, spray some paint in, just a light amount. And then I'll just fill in the center freehand because those edges aren't going to go anywhere, and then dust some paint over to the right. Along the edge of that maxilla, it's raised up so it's catching some of that light. I'll use my eraser just to start pulling some of it out. And then once that's done, we have a placeholder in for the shape of the nose itself. So I'll just come in with my eraser again, work into the orbit, the frontal bone, the nasal bone, just kind of hit everything one more time with that eraser just to add some texture into it. while I'm doing this, adding in the small texture, I'm still always thinking about those major values because that's going to form everything. That's going to be the shapes and the planes of the entire skull. I ripped a curve in a sheet of paper and I'm going to use that as a shield to paint in the lower part here. And once I have some of those edges in, I'll just spray the rest in freehand, and then I'll just continue with some ripped pieces of paper, just spraying in some of the edges that I see. The goal here is to get some of the dark shadows inside the skull itself, just as dark as the black background. So I'll line up that paper, start spraying paint over to the left side, and then just continue building that out. The thing that makes this painting a little bit easier is that the entire background is a solid color of black. And even though there is a lot of masking and shields involved in this one, it's not as difficult as something with a more complex background. I'll just continue spraying that black paint into the background, and then what I want to do from here is use an X-Acto blade and just pull out this very thin highlight along the left side. I'll start on the top of that maxilla and just slowly pull out some paint, making sure it's a little bit choppy. I don't want to pull out a single bright highlight. And of course, some of this is going to be too bright, but that's okay. We can glaze some paint over later on. So this is where I'm going to wrap up part one. I think I covered a fair amount of information in this one. We still have a lot of work to do in this one, so we'll pick it up next week and complete everything. And that video is going to be only about techniques, no art history in that one. I'd like to welcome the newest channel members this week, Sandra, Neil, and M. Webb, for rejoining. Thank you guys all so much and welcome. And before I go, I just want to thank the long-term channel members. That's Andrew M. Shibley, Ken, Pete, Dwayne, Carl, Mackie, Mark, John, Adam, Robin, Peter, William, Hector, Adrian, Israel, Thomas, Phil, Mark, Tony, Airbrush Art and Customs. I will be thanking the rest of you guys next week, but it really means the world to me, so thank you so much. So that's it for this one. I will see you guys back here next Friday. We'll finish painting this skull.